A constant undercurrent since the 80s and the 90s, one that was confined first of all to Europe and the US and then spread to the rest of the Western world and is now within countries like India also, is vaccine opposition and its related movements. This has yo-yoed constantly across global news cycles, and now vaccines are back again in the forefront in the news cycle. Why? Because one of the world's most notorious vaccine deniers is all set to likely lead the US healthcare system by becoming health secretary after having already had a track record of spreading measles among children. Why is it important to talk about actions of a prospective government official in a foreign country? Because when it comes to diseases, especially infectious diseases that spread in societies and affect multiple people outside of one individual, we know that what happens in one country affects all other countries. Air and water and contagions do not respect national borders, and this particular country does ensure that whatever it does indeed affects millions, if not billions of people around the world. Of course, we're talking about the US and RFK Jr. becoming the health secretary, but more importantly, there is something happening in the US. There is the rapid spread of H5N1 that's occurring there among animals, among cattle, and now among humans. And we are going to be hearing a lot more about this over the next few months and about vaccines. So what is the debate here when it comes to vaccines? Vaccines lead to autism, and vaccines lead to other kind of disorders in the body. That's what is the assumption here, which the scientific community is trying very hard to combat. Now, there are lots of things that have happened since the pandemic that has given us a little bit more perspective. COVID vaccines were ruled out. There were adverse events, and we'll come to that. And the vaccine rollout and these adverse events fueled rampant mis and disinformation about public health. Now, the best way to evaluate all the information we have about vaccines and how they affect our health is simply to just go chronologically in the meticulously documented details that we already have available in the medical community. So, in the first part of our video, we're now being transported to the late 18th century to the second half of the 1700s in England. Here, there was a man named Edward Jenner who had been obsessed with birds, with cuckoos and their behavior. And at the same time, he was also becoming slightly obsessed with traditional Asian and African medicines as well as animal health. Now, he had seen some experts dabble in what is known as inoculation. Today, we know how inoculation works. A little bit of infected material is introduced into a healthy body. The healthy person's immune system panics and fights those foreign bodies that are entering the system, and they start to attack. This process of attack involves certain immune cells that essentially consume and kill these foreign bodies. In the process, they obtain the genetic material of these foreign bodies, and this helps mount a more personalized immune attack about a week or so later. And once that is done with more specialized immune weapons, the details of what the immune system killed is processed and stored in the body's long-term immune memory. The next time a similar particle or a similar cell that has these same genetic components are introduced in the body, the immune system immediately checks with its database, sees that it has defenses against this particular invader, and then promptly mounts an attack and kills it, preventing disease. This is inoculation. So in the mid-1700s, Edward Jenner, our present protagonist, was studying birds and animal infections and indigenous medicine and medical practices when a famous medical writer and poet named Mary Montagu identified and observed this process of simple inoculation that was being done in Central Asia. She brought the practice with her to England. Now, in England, smallpox was spreading left, right, and center. Not just in England, across the globe, and medical doctors were treating it with variolation. Variolation is inoculation with the variola virus, which is the cowpox and the smallpox virus. So it's just called variolation. what these medical experts would do is take a little bit of pus from an infected person and very gently introduce a tiny drop of it into a healthy person through a cut in the skin, say. Then this person would become slightly sick with brief fever and discomfort, and then they would recover. And subsequently, they never caught smallpox. Of course, methods were not standardized or tested, and people were experimenting, so many other participants ended up contracting disease and dying. Meanwhile, what was also coming to the forefront was that many other physicians began realizing that cowpox and smallpox were related, and they started inoculating people with cowpox to prevent smallpox. This is ultimately what led to the production of vaccines. In the 2 decades after 1770, at least 5 to 6 very famous doctors in England came up with their own version of vaccines. Ultimately, it was our hero, Edward Jenner, who standardized the procedure and made it harmless and easy to be used across the population of people. He demonstrated this in 1976. He one day called his gardener's son, who was named James Phipps. This little boy was about 8 years old, and Edward Jenner was also working with a patient named Sarah Nems, who was a milkmaid who worked on cows, who milked cows and had a favorite cow called Blossom, which had given her cowpox. Now, what Jenner did was he took variolous material from Sarah and injected it into the little boy. So this material contained cowpox or the variola virus. So the boy developed a mild fever and nausea, but that's all. Jenner then injected him with more material. Nothing happened to him. And then some more in both his arms. Nothing happened. He was exposed to the cow Blossom. He was exposed to cowpox. He was exposed to smallpox. Nothing happened to him. He was completely fine, while others, say people who were exposed to Blossom, continued to contract cowpox. Subsequently, Jenner was able to show that inoculation with cowpox material protected against smallpox with proof, and with his medical training and his confidence, he introduced his own method of inoculation. He inoculated his son, and eventually by the 1830s and 40s, results of vaccinations were so positive that it began to be accepted by the medical community, and the former unsafe practice of inoculation or variolation was banned now that there were safe to use vaccines. So through 1800s and 1900s, vaccines were introduced free of charge across many countries in Europe. Many Spanish explorers, in fact, traveled to the New World with their vaccines to inoculate the local populations of South America to prevent disease. Of course, a lot of it was also done to protect troops for colonialism during colonial times. Napoleon very famously constantly had soldiers dying of smallpox, and suddenly he found himself making vaccines mandatory and free for the French public and the French troops. He even thanked Jenner personally and released 2 English prisoners of war because he wanted to repay Jenner for the favor he did to humanity. Even today, Edward Jenner is considered one of the most impressive figures in medical history, and his work perhaps very single-handedly saved millions, if not billions, of human lives and animal lives. Today, vaccines have entirely eliminated 2 diseases from this world. In humans, smallpox has been completely eliminated, saving billions of lives at this point, and in animals, especially cattle, rinderpest has been eliminated. After over 150 years of vaccinating multiple generations across the world, smallpox has completely gone. People don't even remember today what it was like to get smallpox. This is one of the problems with public health. A lot of people don't remember what it was like to have smallpox or polio. In fact, polio is an interesting disease because today in the US, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. ascends his position, there is talks of rescinding the polio vaccine. And for the first time, we see a push against anti-vaccination from the right wing in the US, because those old senators who are sitting in the US lawmaking positions actually do remember their classmates dying and getting maimed by polio. Today, polio exists only in a handful of people in hard-to-reach tribal mountainous regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan. It has been completely almost eliminated. It does not exist in any other country. There is no polio in the world. It's almost gone except in a handful of people in these two regions. But of course, it looks like United States is going to have more polio cases soon because the vaccine might be rescinded. Why? Because some people have decided to say that vaccines are dangerous. Not true. Some people say that vaccines spaced close together are dangerous and risky. Also not true. Or some say vaccines might work, but they mostly have a lot of serious adverse effects that leads to other kinds of problems and therefore not beneficial. Not technically untrue, but also not exactly true. We'll get to this. But why? Why is there vaccine skepticism when vaccines have helped humanity across the globe, billions of people, for more than a century? Why are people suddenly scared of vaccines again? Well, the answer is medical fraud that occurred just about 40 years ago. Now we come to the second part of her video, which is 200 years after Jenner and his famous life-saving experiments to the 1980s and 90s to a ridiculously dumb, exploitative, malicious, manipulative, evil, money-driven, completely factually incorrect and sensational research paper, which ended up being one of the prime examples of large-scale scientific frauds. This is the publication of the paper in 1998 by medical practitioner Andrew Wakefield that connected the MMR vaccine with autism. The MMR vaccine is a vaccine that a lot of us love, especially here in India. It covers mumps, measles, and rubella and has given protection to millions of children born across the globe. The MMR vaccine is administered very quickly within the first 2 years of the child's birth and protects for life. Since at least the 70s and 80s, the vaccine has been saving lives of millions of babies and adults. And when it first came out, the company Merck was manufacturing it. Now, in 1998, a paper was published in the medical journal Lancet by 12 medical professionals belonging to England. Before publication and during release, this study was publicized in a press conference in a hospital where the research had been carried out. The paper studied 12 children who had gastrointestinal problems and autism, and it contained details with very graphic images of these developmental disorders in these children. The paper essentially concluded that the bowel symptoms that the MMR vaccine combination induced apparently led in turn to autism. This was the conclusion of the paper. In the press conference, Wakefield actually said he suspects the combination of vaccines and asked people to use a single vaccine instead of the combination. This press conference was extremely sensational and the British media ran with it for months and months. The images were crazy, there were children that had problems and the media went nuts. Everybody talked about how the MMR vaccine induced autism and deformities and bowel issues. Of course, the science community disagreed because nobody was able to replicate this study. Replication simply means gathering the same data and arriving to the same conclusions, which people were just not able to do. Again and again and again, studies show that nobody was able to make this link between vaccines and autism again. Now, fast forward a little bit, about 5 years to 2004. Investigative reports started coming out that revealed the details of this published MMR study. First, the funding of the study. This Sunday Times investigation found that there was an active conflict of interest in the study. In fact, two. Turns out that Andrew Wakefield was paid for by lawyers who intended to bring down Merck, which sold the MMR vaccine, and bring a class action lawsuit driven by litigation against them for the purposes of doing so, simply. On the back of this study was a planned launch of another vaccine by Wakefield himself, who planned to make more money of it. We'll come to that in a bit. Now, studies conducted on people and animals require ethical clearances. Ethical committees review requirements of the study, evaluate the conditions of the participants to be selected in the study, and greenlight it to proceed. This is for the safety of participants, for informed consent, and is also a mandatory process in research. Subsequent investigations showed that Wakefield and another parent of one of the 12 children of his study planned to start a competing venture using results of this study. And necessary ethical approvals for the study were not obtained. Yet again, investigations showed that multiple other experts from different parts of the world who tried to gather data about children, bowel problems, vaccines, and autism, and also observe, simply could not come to the same conclusion. So experts looked at the data, and then it turns out that the data was fudged, like super fudged. Studies showed that Wakefield had manipulated data to show what he wanted to show, and multiple investigations concluded that the study's results had been falsified and were disingenuous to promote a certain feeling of antagonism against these vaccines. In 2011, more investigation was conducted and more details began to be known about the breakdown of the 1998 autism paper, and it showed how the data of all 12 children was suitably cherry-picked. This is compounded by the fact that peer reviewers, other professional scientists, had problem with the paper. But instead of getting released within the scientific community first and hearing feedback from other groups of scientists, it was instead released along with a large public press conference with graphic photos, even before other scientists could weigh in on the matter and evaluate the methodologies of the study and its dodgy results. Wakefield then subsequently planned to launch a litigation-based testing system, and he had claimed that he can make over $43 million per year in simply diagnostic tests if he could keep up the attention the study was getting and push more anti-vaccine sentiments. He also wanted to patent a rival vaccine that would take business away from Merck. Much of this expose is from the British journalist Brian Deer, who blew the lid open after almost a decade on the giant fraud that this study was. Andrew Wakefield then sued the channel that the investigative reporter was working for, but then subsequent investigations revealed that even that court filing had a conflict of interest with undisclosed payments from British lawyers who began funding the autism study before it was published. And these were lawyers who were trying to get away from providing legal services to poor people in British society. More details and additional reading will be linked below. In 2004, 5 years after the study was published, 10 of Andrew Wakefield's 11 collaborators withdrew their names from the paper after its methodology and results were questioned. The paper was partially retracted in 2004 and then completely retracted in 2010. The journal Lancet described this paper as a fraud and said that the journal itself had been deceived. Andrew Wakefield subsequently has had his medical license rescinded and revoked. He is widely regarded as a massive fraud and a grifter and a harmful person to the public health and medical community. There have been at least 50, if not hundreds, of studies and experiments that try to prove the same thing that he did, and not one has succeeded. Meanwhile, vaccines have continued to save millions and billions of lives over the past 200 years. Now, what's the consequence of all of these? People have concerns about vaccines today. Some are seemingly legitimate because of the nature of discourse, but not really medically. There is a lot of manipulation of information, misinformation, and disinformation, and people are worried about too many things when it comes to vaccines. Many are worried about spacing vaccines too close together. What does that mean? That the immune system would have to work twice as hard to target 2 different diseases or 3 different diseases. This happens all the time in nature. I have had dengue, and during it I developed a common cold, and my immune system was able to deal with both. People have multiple illnesses all the time. A person with, say, COVID can also have autoimmune disease like MS. All these diseases require multiple kinds of immune response, and our system is well capable of responding to multiple diseases with no problems, unless there is an immune problem, of course. There is absolutely no risk in not spacing vaccines out. The recommended time for administering vaccines is followed in hundreds of countries, and children living in 1 or 2 countries are not suddenly so special and so weak and so non-human that they will get hurt by 2 vaccines back to back, or 3, or 10. The recommended procedures and spacing for vaccines work. Then there is adverse events. Vaccines, of course, utilize material in the world around us, and people are allergic to things in the world around us. For example, if someone is allergic to eggs, they can't really take the yellow fever vaccine because the vaccine utilizes egg material to be produced. For COVID vaccines, there are certain conditions like thrombocytopenia or blood clotting that gets induced, and people who have a predisposition to those kind of conditions have problems with the vaccine, and it might not be safe for them. But vaccines are tested for safety and efficacy first, and there aren't really many public health bodies that roll out vaccines on the basis of improper testing. One problem in a trial immediately translates to hundreds of thousands of people among millions developing a problem. So if there had been a problem with the vaccine, the kind of issues we would be hearing would be at that scale. So while adverse events no doubt exist very much for a very minor chunk of the population, a lot of what we see being attributed to adverse events is simply not true or logical. But especially in India, that said, we need very strong and rigorous adverse events reporting and recording to improve our public health infrastructure. But when it comes to vaccines themselves, we have a wonderful public health infrastructure within this country and in a large part of the global south. That, thankfully, is a very big advantage that the public health system has in the global south. However, the global south is not immune to misinformation and disinformation and shady funding. So, what is the conclusion of all of this? One thing we definitely know is that since the publication of the Wakefield paper and subsequent media reports, preventable deaths by vaccine have gone up by thousands, if not millions. There have been a lot of grifters and scamsters at the forefront of this anti-vaccine sentiment, weaponizing it for their own reasons. Public health has been endangered so much that even rational, scientific-minded people sometimes express vaccine skepticism, which, when broken down into its core argument, does not make sense scientifically. Wakefield's research also threw a wrench into the works of understanding autism and gastrointestinal disorders. All in all, effectively, a lot of people died and suffered because of the publication of this paper and the subsequent press reports. And today, many continue to do so because this disinformation is so actively pervasive on the internet and in unfortunate mom forums. Vaccine skepticism and opposition to vaccines today is a giant red flag when it comes to science and understanding of public health. The purpose of vaccine skepticism is to prevent usage of a vaccine, which in turn leads to ultimately spread of avoidable diseases and then subsequent medical exploitation, all because of one person who wrote something purposefully manipulative and harmful to make money for the rest of his life. Today, COVID response showed us just how pervasive the anti-vaccine and anti-science fear-mongering has spread into the public domain. And we can also very easily trace where the money for these ideas come from. As an RFK Jr. takes his place at the top of the health agency and talks about recalling the polio vaccine and the highly dangerous bird flu spreads among mammals, we will see more of the trailer that we saw during COVID, the active harmful effects of manipulated studies and manipulated media on the world and the world's children and the innocent animals both in human societies and in the wild.